Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, sisters, friends, and the foes out there, and welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Dilly Hussain. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to remind all the avid podcast listeners that you can find this episode and all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. And if you're tuning in via YouTube, don't be cheeky. Do remember to click subscribe. Today's guest has come on upon popular request of viewers and listeners for a good amount of time. He is someone whose own podcast I have been admiring from afar. But more than that, he is someone who is known as a political thinker, writer, lecturer, the founder and the host of the popular Thinking Muslim podcast. And that's none other than Brother Muhammad Jalal. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, Brother Dilly. It's really a pleasure and honor to be on your show. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallah feek. Many won't know this, but I did once come onto your show many years ago to talk about Dilly Hussain.
That's right.
Myself and Sim, but that was only when you were audio only.
That's it. That's right. We should go back to that show. We should do it again, actually. It was a great show.
Do you think the Dilly hype has died down now?
It probably has. It probably has. Although I think there are still people you come across who haven't come across Ertugrul, and they begin to watch it, and 2 months later they're still watching it. So it's mashallah. It has that staying power, doesn't it?
Your podcast, the Thinking Muslim podcast, mashallah, is seeing exponential growth in the last year, 2 years, especially on YouTube.
Yeah.
Do you remember what was the first episode you released on your channel? I do.
Yeah, it was with Hamza Zotsis, or at least the video episode was with Hamza back in January of 2023.
So in the last year and a half, you're now practically on 160,000 subs. Some episodes have reached serious numbers. Did you envisage the project growing this fast?
I didn't actually. When I first began the project, as always, you know this better than I do, Dilly. You ask Allah for help, and we have very limited means, all of us, right? In the Muslim space, we just don't have the means that other podcasters or other YouTube people have. And so, we were thinking maybe a few thousand people will view these videos, but alhamdulillah, we want to make something of quality. Mm-hmm. And mashallah, as you quite rightly described, it's just hit off. And as you said, some of the shows do extremely well, and they go around the world, and people contact us, in particular non-Muslims. I always find that and you must get this, right, the non-Muslims who contact the show to be particularly humbling as an experience, because they come into it as people who aren't necessarily from within, certainly not within the fold of Islam, but they are amazed to see that Muslims are having this level of conversation with one another. And it's a route into Islam, actually. For a lot of them, it's a route into finding out more searching questions or asking more searching questions about Islam. So alhamdulillah, we ask Allah to give us barakah in everything we do, alhamdulillah.
Ameen. In terms of the kind of appeal that you have to certain audiences, would highbrow be something that would be appropriate to describe the thing?
I'm waiting for you to say like a Waitrose audience.
No, but it's nice. Aesthetically, it's nice. The people that you bring on are deep. You certainly talk way less than me, and listen to the guests more.
Because you have much more to say than I do, Dilly.
I don't know, but honestly, the fact that you recently had Owen Jones on,
right?
Owen Jones doesn't jump on any Muslim podcast, especially knowing in terms of his lifestyle choices and the positions that we espouse. It's not necessarily a popular thing to do, but you managed to have him on. You managed to have the former Prime Minister of Malaysia on, Dr. Mahathir. These are huge guests, right? That's massive.
Barakallah feek. A lot of this comes down to our viewers. Our viewers have amazing contacts, and they tend to have conversations with these people and ask them to come onto the show. So a lot of it is done by our viewers who recommend or at least introduce us to these guests. I mean, the Mahathir one was an interesting one. I remember sending out a tweet, and it was someone who followed me on Twitter who said, I listen to your show all the time, and by the way, I work with Mahathir and I can get him for you. So a lot of it does come through.
Abdul Hakim Murad rarely jumps on external podcasts.
We haven't had him for a while. I mean, he came on to our audio podcast, that's right, and we talked about modernity. I think what it is, people know that the Thinking Muslim, like your show, they know that we're going to have a credible conversation and a quality conversation with our guests. And so it doesn't require someone to buy into everything, to your worldview. You know, especially if you're a non-Muslim, you're not necessarily going to buy into an Islamic or a Muslim worldview.
Absolutely.
But, you know, most people know that they will have a fair, you know, conversation with us and a good quality conversation. So alhamdulillah, I think that's really been our pitch, and it's worked so far.
In terms of your personal standards and red lines, as a host and a founder of a popular podcast, do you kind of have type of guests that you wouldn't host or wouldn't platform? So, for example, in my case, I wouldn't have an Israeli there.
Sure.
If Netanyahu or anyone from the Israeli occupying administration wanted to have an interview with me, I would say no.
Yes.
Right? Someone who calls for the open slaughter and oppression of Muslims, I can't host you. Right?
Yeah.
So do you have any type of red lines and like standards when it comes to hosting guests?
For sure. These are our red lines. I mean, we make sure that the guest is not someone who explicitly harms Muslims and Islam. And so the guests we bring on our show have to be people who, you know, who generally speaking, you know, we're not going to agree with all of their views. And certainly, why should we, right? Even if they're a Muslim, why should I agree with everything a Muslim believes in for him to be on my show? But we need to make sure that the person who comes on the show is not someone who's undermining our deen and is responsible for harming our deen. So we have there's a team of us. We've got a team of, you know, editorial staff and researchers, and we have constant conversations about people. And sometimes we do invite guests. I'm not going to name the guests, but we invite guests, and then we disinvite them because after researching them, it becomes very problematic to have them on the show. It's not an accurate science, I have to say, and as you know, and sometimes you're going to make controversial decisions and invite people that may be just close to that line. But I think from my side, we said from the very beginning, and my editorial team are far stronger than I am on this sometimes because I get carried away.
Okay.
They come back to me and say, no, you said to us at the very beginning, we're not looking for hits. We're looking for quality conversations. And so are you getting this guest because he or she may give you some temporary hits on YouTube? And I think it's really grounding to have people like that around.
Alhamdulillah. And you know, when you had a pull or a desire to have a guest on who may just bring a short-term wave of views because they may be involved in something trending.
Yes.
How many times have you pulled back like, okay, fine, this may be not wise?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Actually, I don't think it was necessarily we went for someone because of their ability to pull large numbers, but because of a contemporary issue. So, for example, I'll give you an example. There's a guy, an academic we invited, who, you know, he was in the news. We decided to go with him, and it was a non-Muslim guy, you know, and then he decided to have, you know, a Twitter war where he talked about he's pro-Russia, pro-Syria, Assad, and he was very clear, very open about this. And I remember then having a conversation and saying, look, I'm afraid I can't, you know, I find this very difficult to invite you onto my show if you're going to be very openly pro-Assad. And actually to the degree that he was belittling the Uyghur genocide, and he was, you know, he was suggesting that all of the opposition to Assad are terrorists, right? And and you know, fine, if this wasn't just an academic article he had written, it's tucked away somewhere on the internet. This is his main argument. There's, you know, he has this anti-imperialist worldview. And so I disinvited him and said, look, it's just not for us. And it was an amicable exchange, but you know, we're not going to invite people like that onto our show.
I'm glad you mentioned that example because it would be relevant to my next question, which is much of today's conversation is going to be about the ongoing genocide in Gaza and how it's impacted us here in the UK, especially with a general election looming.
Yeah.
But many of the outspoken, at least online, many of the outspoken advocates of the Palestinian cause have been those who take very principled positions on that conflict. But on those conflicts and issues, they border denial to enabling, right?
Like on Syria.
Yeah, like on Syria. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. I mean, we have, you know, Galloway as a prime example. I remember you even tweeted, alluding to it directly, indirectly, that look, you know, is the situation that desperate whereby we need people who deny X, Y, and Z to talk about Palestine? We can name others, right? So there's been lots of people who have been seem very outspoken and have amplified the voice, at least on X and beyond. But at the same time, they hold very, very problematic positions on Syria, on Assad, on the Uyghur situation, and generally Russia as an imperialistic power in the world, and how its hands are drenched in the blood of Muslims. How do you do that? How do you balance it out? So what's your thoughts on that? Is that one of your red lines?
It certainly is a red line for me. I mean, and by the way, I'm not going to say that everyone needs to apply my criteria to guess, because I think...
No, I'm just curious. I really want to know for one podcast or another.
No doubt about it. We certainly will have different criteria. And I'm not going to say your criteria is any worse than mine or better than mine. It's just the way we are. Look, my view is that where there are people who actively engage in a narrative which dispossesses some of our Muslim ummah from their lives and their wealth and their lands, because it falls within this anti-imperialism banner. So George Galloway is a prime example of that. George Galloway, for me, is a charlatan. He's someone who makes his life's aim. He makes his agenda is based on this anti-imperialism, this pro-Russia, pro-China view or way by which he views the world, viewpoint upon the world, where he observes Muslims who are standing up to these regimes to be insignificant. So Syria is an example.
Or agents of the West in the CIA.
Or agents of the West.
Yeah.
So he regards all of the Syrian opposition to be agents of the West. His view about the Uyghurs is that the Chinese government are fighting a war on terror. This is a term he used, a war on terror against the Uyghurs, because these people are
Takfiri, Salafist terrorists.
And so he effectively uses an American narrative. This is what the Americans say about Muslims in Iraq, what the Americans said about Muslims all over the Middle East that they went to war with, and in Afghanistan, of course. So I would never platform someone like that, because I know by platforming him, we're putting him on a pedestal. We're giving him an opportunity to be liked by the Muslim community, where in fact, I think part of the Muslim vote conversation, and it's a conversation I have with brothers from the Muslim vote team all the time, part of what we should be trying to do is we should be trying to build political literacy within the Muslim ummah. And part of that is we need to be able to have a Muslim community that is able to distinguish between those who are real allies and those who are actually our opponents. And I would go as far as to say George Galloway is our opponent. I don't think he's an ally. And I think politically, it's a naive position to be in, where we, for our short-term objectives, we defend him and we platform him. Now, that's my personal view, by the way.
No, it's an interesting one. Brothers and sisters and friends, I see that you're enjoying the content. How come you've not clicked subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel? And if you're watching via Rumble, how come you've not subscribed on our Rumble channel? If you like the content, you like the guests, you like what we're talking about, it's absolutely inexcusable and cheeky for you not to click subscribe. Thank you, and Jazakallah khair. What's your thoughts on not holding non-Muslims to a standard which we should only really hold to Muslims? Let me give you an example, right? And I'm going to be very candid about this, right? A non-Muslim, someone who is essentially, has kufr in their belief, right? I don't expect them to be consistent. I'm going to be honest with you.
You're right.
Not on every single issue. Right. I don't expect them to align with me morally on every single issue. I don't expect them to have a concept of wala and bara. I don't. I genuinely don't. So given that reality,
good question.
Is it fair? I mean, what's your thought? Because is it fair to then hold them to a standard which sometimes even our own fellow Muslims fall short on?
No, it's a very good question. I mean, see, when it comes to moral positions and social positions, sometimes it's tricky, actually, very tricky. But I think on political positions, you don't have to be a Muslim to recognize that what the Uyghurs are experiencing is nothing short of a cultural, if not a physical genocide.
Absolutely.
Right? And so you don't have to be a Muslim and have a higher value system of wala wal bara to be able to come to that type of conclusion. It's just, you just have to follow political events, and you actually have to be pretty perverse to say otherwise. And I would go as far as to say people like Galloway are politically perverse when they back Assad, because it's convenient for their worldview, or back the regime of China because it's convenient for their worldview. So I think there's a difference. I hope you can see that difference. Whereas, for example, there are some inevitably you invite a non-Muslim onto your platform, and even some Muslims onto your platform, they're not going to necessarily agree with every single moral position that you have, because these moral positions come from a series of conversations you have with Islam, right? You don't need to have that conversation with Islam to know that these people, that the Chinese regime or the Assad regime, are committing crimes against their people.
Let's scope out a bit and let's look beyond George Galloway, right? And let's look at the general thinking that does exist among some Muslims.
Yeah.
Is that, number one, having competing superpowers instead of Pax Americana, but having competing superpowers and talk of BRICS and stuff like that. In fact, there's one prominent content creator who speaks to himself and rarely gives interviews, if ever, talks about the forming of some level of political autonomy, siding with China and Russia against, the West's hegemony and stuff like this. Yeah. Those who do believe of the axis of resistance type of thinking, many Pakistanis look favorably to China, as do other Muslim countries. You'll speak to many people who have favorable opinions towards Russia, simply because they see them as a balancing act or a better or lesser evil to America. How do you address those issues? They will have favorable positions towards Russia and China because they're so anti-West, and anything that's anti-West becomes pro-Muslim. Do you see problems with this type of thinking?
I see problems with this type of thinking because so as Muslims, the way by which we observe the world has to be according to an Islamic framework of thinking. And part of the Islamic framework of thinking is that we want ultimately to design a world built upon Islamic principles. Now, that's not an Al-Qaeda, ISIS type of attitude. No. That's we want to revitalize a order that's built on those principles that undergirded the international system, until the 1920s when the last Ottoman Caliphate fell, right? So in our mind, we want to be the masters over our own narrative. We want to be the ones who make history, not the ones who are constantly under the thumb of one major power or the other. The problem with these narratives is that it plays to the weakest position we can ever be in, and that is that Muslims can only be in a multipolar world full of great powers. Muslims can only be an insignificant power under these multiple poles, right? And I find that a problematic language because, of course, we want to build our ummah to a position where we are one of these great powers, and where we are able to design history, and where we are able to do the subject of ordering. We are able to order the world. So I would say that there needs to be some deep thinking about international politics, actually. Now, by the way, I don't disagree with the idea that the more the world becomes multipolar, the more America's grip on this world is going to decline. So I agree with that narrative. And I agree that as China rises in particular, because China actually is the only real competitor to Russia, is not that competitor. China is the only real competitor to America, and China has the economic, cultural, political weight to balance against American power. So we're observing, America at its height and now slowly receding in the world, and the rise of China as this potential superpower. And the question we should ask ourselves is, where do we fit into that, right? Now, I'm not in any way suggesting then that we should look at this and say it's all bad because these are all non-Muslim countries. We want American power to recede in the world. I say this to American Muslims all the time, who suddenly believe in an American exceptionalism, but it's in your interest, because it's in the Ummah's interest, for American hegemony to decline in the world. And you have to think, as an American Muslim, how are you going to contribute to that? Now, of course, a lot of American Muslims have a heart attack at this stage when you say that. But we have to think like that because, we're trying We want a world where a space opens up for the Muslim Ummah and the Muslim world, right? So that the good politicians in the Muslim world can start utilizing that space. For the last 20, 30 years, under American unipolarity, the Muslim Ummah has not been able to sneeze without the Americans catching us, right? They've not been able to do anything. Mm-hmm. American power is receding, China's power is rising, and that is slowly opening up a space in the Muslim world. We've just got to make sure we utilize that space to our advantage. Now, the problem with these, just to give you one final...
Do you think BRICS could be a space?
No, because the BRICS system is too heavily sided towards these unsavory powers like China and Russia. Mm-hmm. And so, at best, the BRICS will be an opportunity to help us open up a space in the Muslim world. But the BRICS system, by the way, the BRICS system it's not an analogous system to say NATO. Mm-hmm. It's a very an organization that is not cohesive, and actually has some lots of internal divisions, India and China being one of them, right? Of course. So the BRICS system isn't particularly a cohesive system. We need to just recognize that BRICS system for what it is. And maybe the BRICS system will give us a space, especially in the economic realm. My point I was going to make is that some of these commentators, they talk about BRICS and they talk about China and talk about Russia. But when it comes to it, what they're really saying is that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are somehow benign actors that are working in the interests of the Ummah.
In essence, that's where it leads to.
And that's nonsense. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, what they're doing is they're trying to create a space for their own, for the preservation of the ruling families of each country and the preservation of their wealth. And that's what they're trying to achieve, right? So these two powers are malign powers in the Muslim Ummah. And we should be looking for these powers to recede in terms of not the people of the countries, but in terms of the ruling families, because they work tirelessly against Islam and Muslims. Just think about what the UAE is unleashed in Sudan. Horrific, right? There are tens of thousands of people who are homeless and who are dying because of what the UAE are doing, because of their lust for power and their
Yemen.
Look at Libya, look at Yemen. These two powers are not powers that are working in the interests of the Muslim Ummah anywhere in the world. Just look at how these two powers have abandoned Gaza. There is a discussion at this minute being had in the highest echelons of the US administration with Saudi Arabia. And the conclusion is that Saudi Arabia is now looking to pursue normalization with Israel in exchange for a NATO-style agreement with America. This is on the blood of 40,000 Muslims. They don't care. So I can't, some YouTuber who tells me that Saudi Arabia is working the long game, I'm afraid, he's been delusional.
We'll revisit this towards the end of the podcast, but just kind of moving away from the Thinking Muslim podcast. 8 months of genocide, 40,000 martyrs, 90% of Gaza inhabitable. The most televised, streamed, filmed, documented genocide of our era. Yeah. It's impacted us all heavily. Yeah. You yourself have been very outspoken on it. Practically this seasons of our respective podcasts have been entirely, if not significantly, focused around Gaza, has it not? Yeah. So, given that, we now have an election looming. You've been speaking a lot about the Labour Party, who we are expected to win somewhat of a landslide, if the polls are correct. Why is there so much focus on the Labour Party and not so much the Tory government that has enabled, collaborated and participated in this Gaza genocide? Why is there so much focus on Labour?
Brilliant. I think this is a fundamental question because, of course, some would say maybe you're pro-Tory and that's why you're attacking Labour so heavily. I think the first point to make is that both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have failed the people of Gaza. In fact, they've colluded with the Israeli government to make sure that there is diplomatic cover for what they are prosecuting in Gaza. And I think we should have that as our starting point. So none of these parties, whether it's the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, have ever worked in a or have placed themselves or put themselves in a position where they are safeguarding the rights of humanity in Gaza. I think that's our starting point. So why the Labour Party in particular? Well, the first thing is, in 2019, 81% of Muslim voters voted for the Labour Party. You and I know that in most of the Muslim communities, we are not just Labour voters, but we are generations of Labour voters. And maybe rightly, if we go back to the 60s, because it was the Labour Party that introduced the Race Relations Act, for example. It was a Labour Party that rolled out the policy of multiculturalism. It was a Labour Party that resisted at the very beginning, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the racism that came from the right. And the Conservative Party, from time to time, and more so today, have worked with these nefarious forces to undermine Muslims on the streets of London and Birmingham and Bradford and other places. So I think the Labour Party has been the recipient of Muslim votes for a very long time. So it's not uncontroversial to say that probably, in terms of bloc votes, they have been the net benefactors of the Muslim vote for a very long time. Not only that, we know that in many of our Muslim communities, and alhamdulillah it's receding today, but in many of our Muslim communities, the Labour Party have established this sort of system of patronage where they pay off councillors and they pay off MPs or they pay off community leaders. And when I mean pay off, I don't mean in an overtly corrupt way, but it's still corrupt. They pay them off by giving community centres, by giving them mosque extensions. It's a perennial thing. And whenever an election comes up, the Labour Party says that they're going to push through a controversial mosque extension. And so the Labour Party have used a system of patronage to establish a community hierarchy where a community leader, usually a tribal leader, suggests to their community, this is the person you've got to vote for, and they can bank maybe hundreds, if not thousands of votes. And we've seen that in places like Luton and most of the Birmingham seats. This is what has happened for a long time. Shabana Mahmood, for example, the reason why she is where she is because her father, is one of these Labour people who was able to guarantee votes by large numbers of community people, right? And that is the lay of the land across the Muslim communities. So the reason why in October I started to think quite deeply about how we're going to punish Labour is simply because Labour was meant to be responsible for speaking up for our interests within our communities. Now, you and I know that they've never been that, and they've not been that since the war on terror. They've not been that since Tony Blair, right? But of course, many Muslims still believed, because the way patronage works is that you've got people who smile and they come to your communities and say Bismillah, and they come to your iftars, and sometimes they even wear a topi when they come to your events. And so you can be fooled into believing, if you're not politically very astute, you could be fooled into believing that these people are out for you and they are your brothers and they're helping you as a community. And that is what has happened. We've got this naivety, and it is a naivety that has embedded itself within the Muslim community. When Gaza happened, alhamdulillah, and I think it's a fantastic thing, that naivety was shown up for what it really was, a political naivety that should not have existed and should have actually gone back in 2001 when they invaded Afghanistan. It was Tony Blair and the Labour Party that did that. So I realised that if the vast majority of Muslims vote Labour and the Labour Party has deserted once again the Muslim community, why are we continuing to vote Labour as if it's the only choice within our communities? So back in November, I wrote an article about independence and why we actually have the tools and the people and the concentrations available to us to bring in independent MPs who speak and fight for our interests and who are not under a Labour Party whip. Just look at Shabana Mahmood. Just look at Naz Shah. Just look at these people. Naz Shah may be on a different side of the spectrum, but she still has to watch her words. Absolutely. Because if she even says that there is a genocide taking place and Israel is on the wrong side of history. What happened to other MPs, as you know, Diane Abbott, as you know, what happened to other people can happen to her and can happen to other Muslim MPs. So these MPs who are Muslim and they live within this party system, every day they're watching their backs. Every day they're watching the words. They've got to make sure that every tweet they send out has to be a tweet that's passed by central office. They've got to make sure. And so in their mind, they convince themselves. And I've spoken to some of these Muslim MPs personally. They're nice people. But they convince themselves that we've got this long game. One day we're going to be able to do a good for this ummah and for our Muslim community, but it's not now because it's too restrictive now. And so they fool themselves into believing that if they are part of these party machineries, that they can achieve something great for this ummah one day. And I met a Labour guy who was one of the most prominent Labour people. I haven't asked his permission, so I can't mention his name. One of the most prominent Labour Muslims in the Labour Party, who left the Labour Party a couple of years ago. And he told me, I spent 20 years believing in this nonsense, that if you're within the Labour Party, you can somehow change it from within and have a policy that's more favourable towards, say, Palestine. And I came to the conclusion after 20 years of trying to do that it's never going to happen. This party is a Zionist party, and it's never going to be favourable towards us. In fact, the Labour Party need a few symbolic token people who are Muslim within the party. And by doing that, they can give the impression that the Labour Party does have a pro-Muslim stand, Labour Friends of Muslims or whatever it's called, Labour Muslims Network and Labour Friends of Palestine. These are all just symbolic gestures to give the impression that the Labour Party is a non-Zionist party. It is a Zionist party throughout. And I believe the day has come where every Muslim needs to disown this party and not vote for it and not participate in any of its organs or in any of its structures. And I know good people, by the way. And by the way, when I say all of this, I'm not saying that these are criminals who are Muslims who are working within it. Some of them are, by the way. Shabana Mahmood is no doubt a politician who has given up on Palestine and has betrayed, I'll go as far as to say, has betrayed the Muslim community in later. Roshnara Ali has certainly done that. You know, she was so duplicitous, for sure. So duplicitous, Roshnara. She gives a speech talking about the virtues of a ceasefire. 5 minutes later, she abstains on the vote in order to keep her front bench position.
Outrageous.
Right? We have got these duplicitous people and we go back to them time and time again. So we have to undermine their vote. We have to punish them at the ballot box.
Do we punish the likes of Afsana Begum, Zara Sultana? This is a conversation that obviously in light of the Muslim vote endorsement and then U-turn. Do we also punish the pro-Palestine outspoken?
You know, I have immense sympathy for the argument that our brothers and sisters in the Muslim vote make, right? So when I criticize them, by the way, some interpreted that as a criticism of the individuals within the Muslim vote. Far from it. I had a meeting yesterday, by the way, with prominent brothers I speak very regularly, actually, and ask advice from a sister who is in the Muslim vote steering committee, because actually she has a lot of political knowledge. And, I pick up the phone and say, well, tell me about X and tell me about Y. So I think, these people are doing a fantastic job. And actually where they have got us is probably, we could not have dreamt of it back in October, where we are now as a Muslim community.
For sure.
So, don't take anything I say about their position and their U-turn as somehow that these people are nefarious actors. Far from it.
No, this is a general discussion point in terms of, like, if the thinking is that the likes of Tulip Siddiq, Roshanara and Shabana didn't vote for a ceasefire, then what about those who spoke at demos, spoke at protests, were quite outspoken? There weren't many of them.
Zara Sultana probably being the key one.
Yeah, and Afsana as well. So
Afsana,
do we punish them as well?
So my view is the following, and it's a bit of a nuanced view, right? It's up to the local communities to make a decision about them. You don't have to, as a national movement, you don't have to endorse them as candidates, because by endorsing them, you're actually endorsing the party whip of Keir Starmer. And some are going to say that's a naive position, but that's actually a very clear political position. You know, every MP who stands for the Labour Party in this next election would have to stand on a platform which is delineated in their manifesto. So Afsana, Zara Sultana are going to have to stand on a platform which the party manifesto lays out. Okay, so and that party manifesto is written by Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer will make sure, because you know there are conventions like the Salisbury Convention in the House of Lords, and the very basic whip system makes it very clear that if you stand as an MP on a platform of the party manifesto, then you are not allowed to vote against any of the provisions of that party manifesto. So the question these MPs have to ask themselves, and it's an MP, by the way, it's a question I asked to many prospective MPs who were standing for Labour. And again, I shouldn't name them because I haven't asked permission. But when I spoke to some of these candidates, and a lot of them reached out to me, and I reached out to a lot of them, and my point to them was, your ability to speak about Palestine and the genocide at this moment in time is curtailed by the very fact that you are under this party whip, and you've got to recognise that. You know, Shabana Mahmood went on a demonstration in Asda in 2014 when Gaza was being bombed. Just think about that for a second. The most prominent Muslim within the Labour Party, Shabana Mahmood, was in a demonstration in Asda, demonstrating against Asda's complicity, or whatever it was. It could have been Sainsbury's or whatever it was, complicity in its trade relations with Israel. Right. This is where she was back in 2014. Look where she is now. She's the most prominent, Labour shadow justice secretary, will be justice secretary when Labour does become, and Labour will become the next government. For the sake of your own position, you've forsaken 40,000 people who've been murdered in Gaza. And that's a shame. Now, so back to your original question.
Is mass resignation is the bare minimum?
For sure. Whenever I met these MPs, I've said to them that you think you're playing a clever game. They're playing you. Mm-hmm. And that's really what's happening. They're playing you, and they're ensuring that they give themselves a silver lining, that there is somehow a Muslim contingent within the party. And so this party is a great multicultural, fantastic party that is working in the interests of Muslims. It's not. It's a party of war criminals. It's a party that has advocated for a genocide. It's a party that uses you as human shields in the same way that the Israelis use children as human shields. These MPs are no more than human shields for a duplicitous genocidal party. And that's how we've got to see the Labour Party. And and that's why my objection to TMV, by the way, wasn't that, there are some people who are trying to play this long game incorrectly, but, how should we position ourselves with these particular individuals? My position isn't to say that you should even position yourselves. Just stay agnostic on it. Agnostic in a, stay agnostic on it, right? Just don't give an answer to that question, and let the local community decide. If you go to a Bradford mosque today, you won't hear a single word being said that's positive about the two Muslim MPs in Bradford. You're going to have to now deal with a community that is outraged at the lukewarm, signals that these MPs have given over Gaza, because they want to keep their position and their patronage within the Labour Party.
Hold up, the show will continue. But before it does, I want to remind you all that the Blood Brothers podcast is the fastest growing English language Muslim podcast in the world. When we deliver unique quality content to you week after week, brothers and sisters and friends, it requires money. So please click the link in the description and support this project however you can. Back to the show. If Afghanistan was not enough, if 1 million dead in Iraq was not enough, if prevent and contest at home, a long list of things that Labour Party is responsible for in terms of detriment to the Muslim community, if all of the aforementioned was not enough for Muslims to part from Labour, what makes you think that 40,000 in Gaza would be enough?
I'm seeing that change. it is interesting, right, Dilly, when back in November, when I wrote this article about independence, a lot of people contacted me and said, "Oh, wonderful article. It's never going to change, right? We are wedded to Labour. Labour is our party, and no matter what you say and do, it's not going to change." But Gaza has been a game changer, and you and I see that, right? We see it. We just have to walk into a Muslim community. Now, of course, the Muslim community is not a monolith, and there are lots of elements of this community. And sometimes we can fool ourselves in, just because we go and visit the local mosque, that may be just a particular type of echo chamber. But I can say that I have had bankers contacted me in the last, few months. I've had people working in the highbrow industries around the city of London, right? Contact me.
Your audience,
my audience, right? I've had Waitrose Muslims contact me who live in Putney, and they have said unanimously that we cannot vote for this genocidal party. And when a person from Putney tells me that we've got to fight this genocidal party, that tells me there's a change.
Okay.
I think there is a shift in them, and we should recognize that shift. I think you and I recognize it, right?
I definitely see it. I think this general election coming up, there's a vibe, there's an energy, there's a sentiment, there's a grievance, there's a seriousness in terms of the way we have organized and mobilized. It definitely, at the very least, is the beginning of something which I think could be very powerful, strategically speaking, for our community. But look, we've spoken about the delusion of some MPs in thinking that it is better to be in than out, that we're more impactful even on the long run, right? Let's put the MPs aside. Let's talk about our fellow brothers who methodologically think it is better to be in than out at any cost. No matter how bad the situation is, it is better to have one of ours, a Muslim, irrespective of how un-Islamic they may come across, but just the perceptive inclusion of them being at the table. Methodologically is better. The maslaha outweighs the mafsada. We've seen this when it's come to even Sadiq Khan's mayoral election this time round. He was endorsed. There were mashayikh and ulama who have been very outspoken on Gaza, but behind closed doors saying, no, Sadiq Khan is still your man, So what's your engagement been like with Muslims from that spectrum and line of thinking?
I feel that what we have a problem with as a Muslim community is what I called before political literacy, the ability to think deeply about politics and about the political system and about how things function and how the system works and how much impact you have within that system. These questions are sometimes not answered, and as a result, we do the same thing over and over again. I remember I had a meeting back in November with the Muslim groups, and I quoted Einstein, and said, that famous quote, the meaning of madness, if you do the same thing over and over again, you expect a different result, right? And my point to them is that's what you're doing. You're doing the same thing over and over again, and then you expect the result to be different. And what is the thing they're doing over and over again? They want to so-called infiltrate these political parties, work within the political parties, establish themselves within the political parties, and then they expect those political parties to bend to their will. That's just not how the system works.
Is it not better to have a line of communication than not have a line of communication?
Now, line of communication is different.
Or a door open, or some kind of opportunity or avenue to keep open.
So the question then arises, because we need to advocate for our interests, right? You can't advocate for your interests if you're outside and you're not having a conversation with these people. So I'm not against conversations, right? My point is about being within the party system and expecting that party system to deliver for you. So let's talk about the conversation we should be having with them. At the moment, we go to them cap in hand, right, or torpy in hand, and we say to them, look, we want 1, 2, and 3 as a Muslim community. And behind our backs, they laugh at us because they think, like they laughed at us on the 15th of November during that ceasefire vote. I heard from enough people from within the Labour Party that the party whips were going around saying to their MPs who were teetering on the edges, don't worry about the Muslims. They can never get their act together. And so they're not gonna vote against you. They're not going to bring you down in elections. Don't worry about it, right? And so some of those MPs that are thinking of resigning from the front bench, they decided to stay on the front bench because they realized that the Muslim community are pretty bad at organizing at a local level. So my point is that as a community, we've got to increase our ability, we've got to increase our thinking capacity, our political knowledge when it comes to how we deal with the political system. Now, you asked the question about engagement. How do we engage from a position of strength? Well, surely the first thing we do is we show our electoral strength. We show that at election time, we can get our act together and we can vote in unison together. And so they realize that we are really a bloc and we are really a community that works together, right? One of the first things I did back in October, November is I sent out a tweet and I just asked, people. I haven't got the followers that you have, Dilly, so it was just, it was a few people. And I asked the question, look, I need some data scientists because we just don't have enough data about the Muslim community and I need someone to help me with the census and help me with the electorate and help me with where we can actually make a difference, right? And subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides, opportunities from places you never would know, right? So a brother contacted me who had worked for one of his big organizations here, who was now in Turkey. And it just so happened I was visiting Turkey that next week in Istanbul. So surreally, we sat in Ushkudar at a cafe talking about data. And he said, yeah, I can do all of this for you. And then we got a group of data scientists together. And what we worked out from looking at the census, from looking at various data sets, is that there are around 100 seats in this country where Muslims can actually hold the balance of power. In other words, we can determine which party wins it and which party loses it. There are 100 seats in this country.
If we vote in a bloc.
If we vote as a bloc. Out of 650 seats, we've got 100 seats that can make a difference. Out of those 100 seats, there are around 25 to 30 seats where if we placed an independent and we didn't split the vote, which is a question I know you want to come to, we didn't split the vote, we could guarantee, inshallah ta'ala, an independent candidate of our choice, right? We're far away from that, I have to say, because of the way that our communities still are not organized and are disorganized. But that is a flag we've got to plant. Just think about this. It will be the third largest contingent of an English party, an English grouping in Westminster. The Liberal Democrats have a pitiful 15 seats, right? In this next election, you'll be lucky if the Liberal Democrats increase that by double to a 30 seat hold in the House in Westminster. They're looking for 30 seats in this election. That's their target. If they get anything more, it'd be surprising to them.
They do well to get 30.
They do very well to get 30. The Green Party have 1 seat, right? UKIP at its height had 2 seats, and these were defectors from the Conservative Party. They actually never won a single vote, and that's because of the nature of the first past the post system and the way in which the Green Party and UKIP votes are diffused across the country. We are actually the only sizable community that have got concentrated votes. Ladywood, think about the 4 or 5, Perry Barr. Think about
Yardley.
Hodge Hill. Think about Yardley. Yardley is an amazing seat, by the way.
Luton South,
Luton South,
Bradford
Luton
West,
North, Bradford West.
Blackburn.
Blackburn, Dewsbury and Batley. These are seats
Bethnal,
where,
Stepney.
for sure, these are seats where the concentration of Muslims means that we have the ability to put into Westminster an independent MP. Now, if you ask me, are we going to do that for all 25, 30s? No, we're not. Partly because of the question you're going to ask next about splitting votes, but partly also because we just haven't wisened up to how we can utilize the political system in our favor. Now, I know that you're going to get a lot of people in your comment section because you have a broad audience, let's put it like that, and a particular type of audience from the right who are going to jump on this and say, here we go, these guys are Trojan horses, right? They're trying to take over. And, my answer to them is no, we're not. We're trying to work with conscientious people across the board. I'm on a call every day with non-Muslims who are asking me about Muslim seats, and I'm asking them about seats within which they're working, right? These are conscientious non-Muslims who care about Gaza, who care about the NHS, who care about the issues that we care about as a Muslim community, and we should be working with them, and we should be, mutually developing relationships where. But what I say to them is, you don't have what we have. I spoke to a very important organizer, and I was trying to explain to them the concept of Jummah Salah, and how many people a community can reach in Jummah. He's from the left, momentum left, right? He said to me, we have nothing like that.
Nope.
He said, you're telling me you can potentially reach 10,000 plus people, on one day in one leaflet drop. On a Friday, you can do that, and people actually go and visit these places. I see it happens every week, week in, week out, right?
Without fail.
And he was shocked to hear this. He said, we will die for something like that in the left. We have those organs and those institutions within our community. Of course, Charity Commission does not allow us to say anything within the mosque, but it allows us to stand outside, rain or shine, and distribute a leaflet, right? You and I know this from days gone, that it works. So we have everything in place. What I think we don't quite have, but we're getting, is a political will.
I remember when the formative months, when you were brainstorming around this idea of organising and mobilising, I suggested to you then, do you see a future Islamic party? Or do you remember when we were chatting?
You did have,
and
back in November maybe.
Yes, and I was, if we're going to prop up independence on the Gaza ticket, right? Moving forward, looking forward, if we're just going to put up independent MPs who are similar and aligned on issues, can it not realistically form into something that could be a party? Have you ever thought about that?
I'm very hesitant about creating a party for all sorts of reasons. And I wrote an article where I talked about this. I'll give you some of them now, and it's not necessarily in any particular order of priority. I think if you prematurely do that, I don't think in the long term it's a good idea. But even if it was a good idea, if you do it now, what you'll end up getting are people who are the wrong people who are going to lead this party, because the wrong people in the Muslim community are involved in politics. I'm going to be very clear about that. We have to make space now for a younger ummah who are far more principled, who are far less involved in Labour Party politics, who care far more about the issues that you and I care about, right? I think we need to make a space. You've done your bit. Some of these old times, we need to learn from them. We need to learn from their mistakes in particular, but they've done what they've done. And a lot of them, unfortunately, have too many fingers in these interests, in these political parties, and they're not going to move away from them. So my view is that if you started that party now, even if it was desirable, you're effectively going to allow the same old people to run the show.
So is the issue one of timing then?
It's one of timing.
Okay.
I mean, maybe it's one of time. I actually don't think it's a good idea going forward, except to say recently I've realized there is a problem, and only a structure can resolve this problem, and that is of split votes that you're going to talk about. That is of what is the arbiter? Who makes the decision at a local level? If you go to a typical political party setup, if there is a dispute at a local level, a regional director will come along and resolve that dispute. We actually don't have that because we're a very diffuse community. And so you can have this odd situation where, unless they're disciplined and they realize the travesty of having two or three candidates that stand against one another, like they did in Bethnal Green and Bow certainly to a degree, like they did certainly they did in Dewsbury. Yeah. I mean, I was in conversation with the brothers and sisters in Dewsbury and Batley for months. And they split into two groups, and these groups were not meeting one another. And I think, to their credit, they realized that if we do this, it's destructive. And they got together, and it wasn't me, it wasn't the Muslim vote.
They
eventually just resolved it together and said, we've got to solve this problem because we need one unified candidate, and they did that. And now we do have Brother Iqbal who's running.
As did Akanji and Ajmal Masroor.
Yes.
We had a situation even in Yardley with Shakil Afsar, another gentleman there, another brother there. And we've had loads of these other situations that have propped up. Yeah. And let's be honest about it. And one of the, realities is the Workers' Party. Yeah. Right? We can't ignore the Workers' Party. We spoke about George Galloway earlier on in this podcast.
Yes.
But let's just talk about his by-election victory. the emergence of the Workers' Party, who I think have are standing candidates in at least 150 more, right? And they're standing against independents. So if you look at Blackman, they've got Craig Murray there, but then there's a Muslim vote endorsed candidate there. In Luton South, we have Atik Malik, who's endorsed by the Muslim vote, but then we have another Pakistani Muslim pro-Palestine candidate for the Workers' Party. We've got many of these situations up and down the country. What's your thoughts on that split vote?
So let's talk about what the Workers' Party, because before we talk about split votes in general, what is the objective of the Workers' Party? So the Workers' Party is not an actual party. And yes, it was formed a few years ago
during the COVID period.
But it's not really a proper party, right? It doesn't have infrastructure. It doesn't have the level of why would it? It's a new party, right? Yeah. So the Workers' Party is really George Galloway, and it's a party that's coalesced around this one individual. Now, so the first thing to say is that it doesn't really have infrastructure, and certainly doesn't have communities around. It doesn't have any. It really hasn't had any impact on any of the communities around the country. In fact, the people who helped George Galloway get elected, were organisations that are external to the Workers' Party back in Rochdale, who came in from outside actually to help him with canvassing and to set up the canvassing.
If I may, Jalal, in a recent conversation with George, he said, look, it's no secret that we are heavily relying on the Muslim vote. Yeah. Certainly in many key constituencies where we've put up candidates. Let's look at Jodie McIntyre, right, being perhaps the most prominent one, and there's others, right? So they don't make no secret about that.
So so just to finish, the point isn't to say what I was saying there. The point is to say that the Workers' Party don't actually expect to win very many seats in this next election. So what's their objective? When I spoke to a high-ranking member of the Workers' Party, their objective is twofold. The first objective is to have access to short money. If you get one MP, but you get over 150,000 votes in this election, then you have access to a pot of money that Parliament gives you, right? That's why the Green Party, by the way, they're not going to win more than maybe probably one seat, if that, in this next election. That's why they've fielded candidates across the country. And I've spoken to high-level, people within the Green Party infrastructure, and they've said to me that, in the majority of these seats, we're not going to do anything, but we need to do it because it's the way the system works. If you can accrue enough votes, then you can get that pot of money, and that's what you need. You need to run party offices. So the first thing is that George Galloway needs to have access to the money. And second thing is they believe that if they had so many candidates across the country, they could get access to those media debates. They didn't get access to it, by the way, but they felt they could get access to those debates, right? Now, so if that's the tactic, then you just put dud candidates in all of these seats, or most of these seats, or candidates at least that have very little profile, but you may be able to get 100 votes here, 1,000 votes here, a few hundred votes here because of George Galloway's profile. And by doing that, you accrue your 150,000 votes across the country. And that is in effect what they've done in the majority of the seats, taking aside people like Jodie McIntyre.
Or Chris Williamson,
right? In Derby South, right?
Derby South.
Jodie was an independent, and he declared as an independent before. And, I've spoken to Jodie on a number of occasions. MashaAllah, a very, competent, clever, intelligent guy, right? You really got a good mind, this brother, right? The way he develops his arguments,
Absolutely.
Right? He felt compelled to join the Workers' Party because otherwise they would have put a candidate against him and it would have split the vote. So what they've done is they've effectively fielded pretty poor candidates. There is a candidate they put in Slough, who the community in Slough say this person doesn't even know what left and right means in terms of politics. They've had a conversation with him, and they don't know. He doesn't know what is a left wing and a right wing. Simple man, right? They've done that across the country. They've put candidates who are pretty poor, who don't have community buy-in, and they've done that for that limited aim that they have. So my advice to communities there's 30 seats where you can get independents. Don't worry about the Workers' Party because they're going to get a few hundred votes. Jodie aside, and maybe one or two people aside, they're going to get a few hundred votes.
Do you think Galloway will take Rochdale?
I think it's going to be very difficult for him. We did a lot of number crunching after the local council elections, and he won something like 8%. His group across. By the way, he wanted to win a majority of the council. His group won 3 or 4 councillors, and they won 8% of the vote in Rochdale. I think if there's a viable, and I say viable with a lot of reservation because no Labour candidate is viable, right? But if there's a viable Labour
him
candidate,
and Reform, isn't it? No,
yeah, that's right. If there's a Labour candidate, and then there's I suspect it's going to be very difficult for him to keep his seat. I may be wrong, but I think that the reason why he won it last time is because the Labour candidate, as you know, Azarelli, he had to step down, and effectively you had that anti-Semitism. So Labour didn't field a candidate effectively, even though he was on the ballot paper, right?
Do you think Chris Williamson can take Derby South? Nope. Jody in Birmingham?
Nope. Jody in Birmingham, yeah, sorry, Jody. I didn't hear you. Yeah. Yes, and I wish he does, and I wish he takes it, and then he abandons the party whip of the Workers' Party because he doesn't need them. You know, I wish he does that, but I think he can do it because Yardley does have you need. I actually not going to give you the figure because otherwise Jess Phillips would know this, but we did a lot of number crunching, and Yardley is one of the lowest hanging fruits in the country. If you get X number of votes, which I won't reveal to you, we can win that seat.
Basically won, yeah. Do you think Ahmed Yaqub can unseat Shabana?
I think it's going to be very tough for him because Shabana's majority is massive, but I think he's going to damage her vote quite considerably. In a seat like Roshanara seat, you can't necessarily. It's unheard of, by the way. If Ahmed Yaqub does it, it will be the greatest swing by any individual ever achieved in British politics, right? Like there's been nothing like it.
Were you impressed with the 70,000 for the West?
It was very impressive. And by the way, when I was speaking to local operators, political operators on the ground, they were telling me, there's a guy I spoke to who's telling me he's going to get 60 to 70,000 votes, right? They could see it, by the way. Unfortunately, maybe people in London in the Muslim community couldn't see it. And I was telling them there is something happening in Birmingham. Now, by the way, we can question some of his styles, right? And we can question, and I would do that. And, if you ask me, okay, I would quibble with some of that stuff. However, he has proven... That's
your Waitrose coming
out. That's my Waitrose coming out, right? He has proven that he is able to win votes.
Definitely.
They estimate he got probably 10,000 votes from Ladywood. That's a good base to start from.
Definitely.
If you start from a base like 10,000, you build on that base. So I feel that there are credible candidates across. Now, you're going to ask me about list of candidates going forward. I don't know. If you ask me, I think Azhar in Slough has a very strong chance of winning.
Ajmal in Bethnal.
I think Ajmal may have a chance of winning. I mean, what he's got against him is the time. His campaign started very late, and for no fault of his own, whatever. His campaign started, and so he had 5 weeks basically to launch his campaign. I think it's going to be a tough ask for him, but we wish him well. And what was done with by removing that split vote has really helped and boosted his ability. So inshallah, I think Liane Mohammed is going to put in a very strong fight. A very strong fight, and Liane Mohammed's got her challenge.
Why does her campaign seem the most mainstreamish? It seems the most slick, and to unseat West Streeting appears to be something quite big, and people seem to be they want to do it. Why is that? What is it about West Streeting? Because Liane's...
Because everyone hates West Streeting. Yeah. And when I mean everyone, I mean if you the more Labour you are, even you hate West Streeting. I have spoken to Labour people. He say to me, I wish Liane beats. Like secretly says, don't quote me on this.
I won't.
Labour, Labour people tell me this all the time. They hate him because he has a disagreeable personality. He's someone who's on the right of the Labour Party to the degree, I think it was Owen Jones that said he's right to Genghis Khan.
Wow.
Right? He is a right winger. He is someone. And there is a lot to say about him as a person. That makes him a pretty disagreeable individual, but his policies are very distasteful, right? And of course, on Gaza, he has been horrible from the very beginning. Why do they look at Liane's campaign? Because her campaign was probably one of the first ones, but also it is a symbolic campaign. Just think about, I was speaking to an elderly Palestinian the other day. It didn't register. He said to me, Jalal, are you telling me if Liane wins, you're going to have all of the West Bank and all of Gaza celebrating the first Muslim Palestinian that enters Westminster? He said to me, even if she doesn't say a word in Parliament, right? which if you know, we've heard about Leanne, she says lots of words, mashallah, right?
Yeah.
Even if she doesn't say a word in parliament, these genocide enablers are going to have to look her in the eye before they sign off on these agreements with Israel, right? So, you know, it's what we call a Portillo moment. Do you remember Michael Portillo?
Of course.
97. He was never meant to lose his seat. He was the rising star within the Conservative Party. They believe that John Major, when he resigns, that Portillo will become the next leader of the Conservative Party. He lost his seat in Enfield South, right? Enfield Southgate. And that sent shockwaves that if he could lose his seat, everyone is vulnerable. Well, if West Streeton loses his seat, that's the Portillo moment. But it's more than a Portillo moment, because on that, at 97, the Conservatives were on their way out. In this next election, the Labour Party is going to win a landslide. No doubt. It's going to win.
Can Andrew Feinstein disrupt those hopes for Keir Starmer?
I would like to say, my idealism says I hope he does. And
we don't like for it to happen.
I speak to Andrew all the time, and I would like him to do so, but I don't think, let me put it like this. Andrew knows that he's not going to win it, but he's not doing it to win it. He's doing it to expose Keir Starmer in his backyard. Right, and to take enough votes from him to make his seat a vulnerable seat. So even if he can make it a marginal seat, you know, an unsafe seat, in other words, you know, a seat which is no longer got a large majority, Andrew would have done a mammoth task, right? So would have achieved a mammoth task. So I wouldn't, by the way, you know, Andrew's a fantastic, you've interviewed him recently. You know, he's a very good campaigner.
I'm very articulate, and of course you'd expect that as a former diplomat and parliamentarian under Mandela. Look, we've discussed the Workers' Party. Let's look at constituencies where there's two independents. We've had that situation. We had that situation in Yardley. In theory, we still have that situation in Bethnal. There's another gentleman, unknown.
Shamsuddin.
Shamsuddin. But we are seeing this situation where there's, you know, multiple independents. I think Bradford West, has multiple independents, 4 independents, subhanAllah. We have in Blackburn, I think, 2 independents at least. So what's your thoughts on those situations? And these are in areas where there's a high concentration of Muslims, and it would be those constituencies that qualify as those key seats, which Labour internally describes as battlegrounds. But in these battlegrounds, you've got multiple independent candidates.
Yeah, what do they say? I mean, I'm going to misquote this, but what doesn't kill you, what you learn from what doesn't kill you. I'm sure there's a more eloquent way of saying it. We're going to have to learn our lessons. The reason why Tasneem Akunji stood down is because he knew what happened back in 2015 when 3 candidates stood who went to the same madrasa together when they were youngsters, and they stood for separate parties, and they split the vote, and Roshnara got in. Right? It was 2010, maybe 2015, one of those days. So they learned from it. They realized you can't go there, because going there makes it impossible to win this seat. There are some seats where independent candidates haven't quite come to that realization. We've still got time. By the way, you can't remove yourself from the ballot anymore. Yeah,
once it's in, it's in.
Once it's in, it's in. But we've still got time to push those candidates that have no viable chance of winning. We've got, they should publicly say we're no longer going to stand, and they should publicly endorse the other candidate in order for that to work. Now, I want to say one thing. Why is this happening? Well, partly it's happening because our community, unfortunately still remains, disunified at a local level, and that's very true. However, we shouldn't discount the fact that the Labour Party is doing this across the country. I have evidence of it, right?
Labour plants.
The Labour Party are trying to muddy the waters. They want things to be so difficult for us that we just give up, and we throw our hands in the air and say it's impossible because we're never going to unify. And so they're trying to and some of these guys have been given money by the Labour Party or given inducements that if you stand against X candidate, then you're going to get this position later on in the future. And I know that's happened, right? So we've got to wisen up to these sorts of nefarious actors that are in our community, but that still work with the Labour Party. And we've had plenty of that, by the way. We've had people who are within the Muslim scene, right, who are privately attacking independent candidates. Liane Mohammed has had that every day for the past 4 months, right? people who are Muslim personalities who are privately working with the Labour Party in order to undermine her on an almost daily basis. Andrew Feinstein's having that, right? Go across those Birmingham seats, and it's obvious that's what's happening in some of these seats. So we've got to wisen up to. And I talked about this a month ago, and alhamdulillah, I think some communities have realised that even if that isn't happening, we can't give the impression that's happening.
Because it is embarrassing.
It is very embarrassing, right?
Bringing the podcast to a close, let's talk about one constituency of Muslims who tend to get ignored or sidelined or dismissed or belittled even. And it's those Muslims who don't vote.
Yeah.
Right? Now, that could be due to religious reasons. They believe it to be haram. You don't want to, give your permission for someone to legislate, which is an attribute of Allah. There is those who just think general apathy, can't be bothered, won't make a change, which would actually be consistent with the wider British public. There generally tends to be between a quarter to a third of voter apathy, right? These people, those who will, spoil their vote as an act of,
the system's bad and so on.
System's bad and so forth. But there is this group of non-voters, right? And there's also rulings being, circulated that, if you don't vote, you could be complicit on this genocide, So what's your thoughts on that spectrum and dichotomy of those who don't vote for those reasons I've just mentioned, and those who say if you don't vote, you're as responsible as those involved in genocide?
I think both extremes are wrong, and to say it's wajib to vote, I think I've never seen a dalil for that, and it's never convinced me, because sometimes tactically, if you live in a safe seat where there's no viable option,
there's no need to vote.
Why would you vote for? What's the difference, right? So if you live in some seat, in the countryside, right, and
in Cornwall or
somewhere, right. I wouldn't bother voting because and it's a safe seat, and the Labour Party or Conservative Party will win it all the time. Why would I? Are you now going to tell me that if I live in Cornwall, that if I don't vote, I'm now committing a sin? Is that what you're telling me? Of course it isn't, because voting is a tool. It's a political tool to give yourself and your community a voice. And you've got to exercise that tool in a judicious way, in a unified and a judicious way. And so I think it's wrong to say it's fard to vote. I mean, that's just nonsense, really. And why bring that into the mix? Because it just confuses, the subject. And I think it's weak, in my view, to say it's haram to vote. Now, I think this. I used to believe that. And I've gone on record to say, I used to believe in this Hukum Shari'i argument that it's haram to vote because the legislation only is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I've been on a journey, as they say, or I've been in conversations with mashayikh and with very knowledgeable people, and I've come to a far more nuanced view about this, that you can use your vote as long as you don't vote for someone who's going to commit themselves to a haram, right? Who's got a manifesto. So anyway, there's a lot of detail to that, but generally speaking, the independents that are standing across the country, fine. We can vote for them. I also believe that you can vote for third parties if you know they're never going to win it, but they scupper it for one of the two big parties. They're never going to win. The Liberal Democrats aren't going to win, or the Green Party aren't going to win vast. But by voting for them, you take your vote away from the Labour Party and you scupper it for them. So I think that's a good way of tactically voting in a constituency where you don't have a viable independent because you don't have a concentration of Muslims, right?
Are you fully reconciled with your departure from the adoption of that position?
Now, here's the thing.
Because it stays with many of us.
It does.
It stays with many of us, deep embedded.
Like it does, and it should do. We should always have, Dilly, you and I know that we should always have a humility that we want to follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we don't want to be on the wrong side here, because we know that every action we do, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to count us for that, right? And so we have to be very careful about what we do, who we endorse, and how we go about, because that's a believer has to think deeply, not just about voting as one action, but voting as a series of 15, 20 actions, 20 grades. And we've got to be careful about each and every single one of those grades before we're on the wrong side. And we pray that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps us, in that mindset. I wanted to say, so the majority of people today don't say it's haram to vote. I've very rarely seen that argument. So, for example, on my way here, I was speaking to a cab driver, Muslim brother, right? Brother Rizwan, who said he's going to look out for this show.
Wicked.
And so I said to him, look, you know Dilly and your 5 pillars? And he said, of course I know Dilly 5 pillars. I said, you know the thinking Muslim, because what is that, right? So obviously, Dilly, you're far higher. Well,
you were speaking to a taxi driver, you know. You know, he could be a Lidl's or a type of guy, not necessarily weight rolls, but go.
I don't know. So I was speaking to him, and I said, "Look, are you going to vote for Atiq Malik? Because he brother happens to be from Luton South, right? And Atiq is, mashallah, great brother who's
Top
standing,
brother.
right? And he said to me, I don't believe in the system." Right, so it's that classic argument.
System
I'm not going to vote. The system is corrupt. Why should I vote for a corrupt system? So we had an hour journey, and by the end of it, we were going on the app, and he was registering to vote. And he said, "I'm going to get my wife to register." You know, when you tell them these independents are people who are going to expose the system for what it is, right? This is another means by which you can show this system for its corruption and for what it's done to our brothers and sisters in Gaza. You know, and he said, you know, his parting message to me is that, you know, you should be having these conversations with everyone in the country. I'm trying to. That's why I'm on Dilly's show, because Dilly's show goes out to everyone in this country. So you know, alhamdulillah, you know, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep your platform preserved, alhamdulillah. But I truly believe that most people, when you have a conversation with them, it makes sense. You know, there were a group of brothers I met who said, look, why are you endorsing the system? And I really respect these brothers, right? But these are brothers who also use the judiciary in their favor. They do constantly have cases in courts fighting for terrorism, fighting for civil liberties. So my point to them is, well, wait a minute, you're using the system here, using the judiciary in your favor, right?
They don't have a choice, they would argue.
Okay, but you're using it. You have a choice. Why don't you just accept the thing that happens to you and stay away from the corrupt system, right? Why do you have to take that such and such case to court? Why don't you just accept the fine? You know, a lady gets puts a banner up and she gets a fine for that banner. Why do you have to take that to court on her behalf? You didn't have to do it. Just pay the fine, right? You're doing it because you're using a system for your purpose. In the same way, that's what I'm saying to you. Use the system for your purpose. There's never been a case. I think this argument about morally, if 8% of the population, or 6% or whatever of the population do not vote, that somehow you're going to bring down the system, makes zero sense to me. At the moment where, 70%, 69% of the population vote, right? In the last election, around 69.5%. Back in 2001, there were 59.4%, rock bottom, lowest it's ever been since the franchise in 1928, right? Lowest it's ever been. Did the system fall apart when 59.4% of the population turned out to vote? We
carried on.
They went to war in Iraq soon after, about 2001.
2 years later.
2 years later, right? Are you telling me that somehow the fact that you didn't vote and the fact that everyone didn't vote, and I didn't vote, by the way, in 2001, as you know, the fact that,
I wasn't 18 in 2001.
SubhanAllah, your wisdom far exceeds.
Well, the white hair,
age,
look, the white hair.
So, I think it's a nonsense argument. I think even if you had 50%, half the population voted, the system will carry on and they will laugh at you. They would say, oh, great. So you've not exercised your right to vote. And we are now going to go to wars. And by the way, I know we're coming to an end. Don't underestimate what Keir Starmer is going to do when he forms a majority. It was Lord Hailsham who talked about the elective dictatorship. If you have enough seats in Parliament, you are a dictator. Right? Tony Blair only lost 4 votes in his entire 10 years. He passed hundreds of pieces of legislation, only lost 4 votes. He went to war in 2 major Muslim countries, right? Don't underestimate what Keir Starmer is going to do when he wins this next election. If he's got a big majority, he is going to go to war with Muslim countries. He's going to back Netanyahu or anyone else that comes, as a leader, as a prime minister of Israel. He's going to back them because his party is a Zionist party, right? he's going to make life very difficult for Muslims at home, and he's going to curtail civil liberties. And don't be surprised that in a year's time, the prevent legislation is tightened. Not loosened, by the way, it's tightened around the Muslim community, because the Muslim community still has too much space to exercise its political values, right? Don't be surprised, by the way, that a French-style system of curtailing the rights of Muslim parents to choose where they send their kids to school. Don't be surprised if the Labour Party does that. I will put nothing past the Labour Party in these coming 5 years. They are going to harm this community. There is no doubt in my mind. And by the way, it's pre-Gaza. I've been reading this. I've been reading what they've been saying, even pre-Gaza. And Gaza is just confirmed in my mind that a strong parliamentary majority for Keir Starmer, a winner's bonus, they call it, for Keir Starmer, is going to harm us as a community. It's in our interest to make sure in every seat in the country we deny Labour a vote. And if we can do that, then maybe their majority is not 170 majority, which Tony Blair got and allowed him to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan and curtail past 7 anti-terror legislations and the rest of it. But maybe his majority is 30, his majority is less. And by doing that, his ability to maneuver in Parliament is going to be much less. You know, Theresa May, with a minority government propped up by the DUP, was a weak government, right? Boris Johnson, with an 80 majority, was a strong government. That's the basic arithmetic, parliamentary arithmetic we're playing for. So I would say to everyone in this country, every Muslim and every conscientious person in this country, you've got to think about the implications of an authoritarian Labour Party that's out of control and what they're going to do when they have the levers of power, right? You know, this is going to be an elected dictatorship. And in 5 years' time, you and I, if we're still here, Dilly, because Ajal is from Allah, but if we're still here because the Labour Party will go after Muslims, no doubt about it. You know, if we're still here, we're going to be discussing how that government has curtailed the very basic liberties that makes Britain still, by the way, probably the best country for Muslims in Europe. You know, I know your right-wing, I was not going to say supporters, your right-wing viewers, your right-wing viewers would be unhappy with hearing that. It's a reality. You know, we still have far more space in this country than our brothers and sisters do in most of Europe.
For sure.
Right? That's not guaranteed.
Is it then strategically wise to then rebel against Keir Starmer's Labour Party?
They would do it anyway.
Okay, is that what it is then?
They would do it anyway. I think by doing that, you send a message that the weight of the Muslim vote has now got to be a calculation. They don't care about it, right? They don't care about any of this, right? Because they know that the Muslims are going to placidly vote for them. If you know that you can slap the Muslim community in the face 100 times and they're going to vote for you, if you know that, then the calculation is, why don't we slap them another 100 times? Absolutely. But why wouldn't you do that, right? But if you know that the Muslim community has had enough and they're not going to show through the weight of their vote, they're going to show that we're not going to accept this party blindly, then they will realize that they've got, especially if they've got a small majority, they would now have to consider the Muslim vote in the next election. And that's really where we've got to be as a Muslim community. I would say to all of those split votes, it doesn't now matter who stands. It doesn't really matter. Okay, it could be, you know, the guy in the blazer, you know, or the guy in the tracksuit. It really doesn't matter. As long as you got the Muslim community behind them, you can do this. One of you has got to step down, and you've got to start being adult about and mature about your vote and your community. I think Tasneem Makunji has done something amazing, mashallah. You know, I think it took a lot of guts to do what he did, and a lot of you know, one needs to be aware of oneself, and aware of one's, you know, and the community, and take one for the community to do what Definitely. You did, right? And you know, I think I wish and pray that more communities do that.
Final question to you.
Yeah.
And I know it's unfair because the question is a podcast in and of itself.
Yes.
What are the priorities of Muslims in the UK?
Yeah.
I mean, given that we've spoken about the Muslim vote generally the Muslim vote as a national strategy, Muslims voting in a bloc to get our interests at the forefront, right? Obviously, in this general election, Gaza is the main issue, not the only issue, to quote Dr. Wajid from the Muslim Vote. What is our priorities? What do you think our priorities are? Is it the preservation of our Muslim identity to prevent assimilation to kind of this secular liberal kind of reality that we've lived in for 3-4 generations? Is it the issue of Islamophobia? Is it the issue of foreign policy? Is it the issue of the fact that a large percentage of our communities are living in poverty, below the kind of poverty line, struggling socioeconomically? What are the issues?
It's all of that. It is completely, it's all of that. We have, like any community, we have a series of interests. Now we're going to have a hierarchy of interests, no doubt about it.
What's your hierarchy of
my hierarchy? For sure, in this election, Gaza is at the very top of that hierarchy. Because Gaza symbolizes, it's not, by the way, it's not just because it's a foreign war, it's not even a war, it's a slaughter that's happening in another country and against, in this case, Palestinian Muslims, right? It's not just that, but the people who have allowed that are the same people who are damaging domestically Muslims and non-Muslims at home. So if you are going to have a disdain for young people, for the lives of children in Gaza, you're going to have that same disdain for young people here, Muslim or non-Muslim, right? You're not going to care about poverty. And that's clear. The Labour Party is refusing to get rid of the two-child cap on child benefits, because they know that they've got to send the right signal to right-wing voters, to conservative voters, and to the corporate elites that now fund the Labour Party. And that would show that they're a welfarist party, and so they can't do that. So Rachel Reeves is doing that out in spite of the fact that even Gordon Brown, who's an ex-Labour Prime Minister, says that if you get rid of just that one cap, millions of children will be out of poverty tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Right?
Overnight.
So we have got a range of interests. And because of what's happening in Gaza, I would say Gaza is certainly at the top of that interest. But it doesn't mean that there are, I agree with Brother Wajid, that you have got other interests in the Muslim community. And a lot of our communities remain impoverished. A lot of our communities still have educationally are doing very badly, right? A lot of the Muslim community, live in very poor housing. Partly because, we are, alhamdulillah, we stick with each other. We've got large numbers, we've got people who live in large family units, right? Multi-generational homes, they call it. So we have got some dire problems in our communities. And we should ask the question, Labour has been our MPs and our councillors for 30, 40 years. What have they really done to solve these problems? Well, of course, they've done nothing or done very little, because they know that we're going to come back and vote for them. So why should they reach out to us and why should they resolve these endemic problems that exist within the Muslim community? And there are many problems that exist within our community. So I think we've got to wisen up. We've got to use our vote wisely. We've got to make sure that we show the weight of the Muslim vote, but certainly our interests are many varied interests, and it's not right to just say that we've got this singular dimension. We only care about Gaza. We care about Gaza for sure, and it's the most important thing that I think about and you think about, and it's something that we lose sleep over, don't we? And we see, it's shocking.
It's impacted us in ways in which previous conflicts haven't. For many of us, from your normal Muslim parent to the child to the dua to the activist, it's affected many of us and non-Muslims as well.
SubhanAllah, it doesn't, and so why shouldn't we make that issue an electoral issue? Like, for those people who say, it somehow cheapens your community, but why wouldn't it? The people I speak to, there are people you meet who say, I have never voted for decades, but I'm going to vote now because I want to punish the genociders, the ones who have committed this genocide in Gaza. And why should we deny them and say that somehow they're politically, they're inastute for doing that? We have got members of our community who still believe that they're politically so sophisticated, right? What they really are people who have gone native, right? They they've gone to enough iftars with Keir Starmer and with Tony Blair and with Rishi Sunak and the rest of them. So now they've drunk from their Kool-Aid, and they believe that you guys are unsophisticated in Luton.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Voting for Atiq. Who is he?
Yeah.
Right? Or you're unsophisticated in Slough. Why vote for this guy, Azhar? You're losing your long-term thinking here, right? But we've got to keep our nerve. The cab driver on the way here has far better political, because the reason why he's not voting is because he sees the system for what it is, and now he realizes that we can utilize that system, and it wasn't that hard to change him. Whereas you're giving money to the Liberal Democrats, and some Muslims have, by the way, they're giving money to the Liberal Democrats, and it's a waste of money because they believe that somehow the Liberal Democrats are going to miraculously change their ways and be less. If you just read the Liberal Democrats manifesto of this last week, they've got 3 pitiful lines on Gaza, and they're so weak, right? Yet Muslims believe that by giving money to these political parties, because you've got lots of money to waste, by giving money to these political parties, that somehow, you're going to, you've done this amazing, sophisticated work. It's tomfoolery, as they say. It's naivety. I have far more confidence in that guy, who's salt of the earth, who sits in the mosque and makes dua for Gaza, than that guy who goes and frequents Westminster and believes that somehow he's at the top of this food chain, and just makes the same old nonsensical mistakes over and over again.
Jalal boy, it was an absolute pleasure having you on. It wasn't that daunting, was it?
I was scared.
Why?
I was scared because Dilly, you are the creme de la creme of podcast. I said to my wife actually before I came here, is Dilly, have I prepared enough? I got this pad out, Dilly.
And I've never had a guest who's had a pad.
I got this pad. I was so, because I thought, Dilly, this is, alhamdulillah, you were very kind to me.
That impression doesn't really exist of me, surely.
It does, Dilly. Come on.
Why is that?
Dilly, you are, mashallah, because you are a chief investigator. Because you're a journalist. I'm just this educationalist that have turned podcaster. What do I know about asking incisive questions? You're a journalist.
No. Well, look, allow me this opportunity to throw some mutual praise towards your way. I think
that's what I was hoping.
Honestly, no, wallahi, I'm being honest with you. I said to you even before we started filming, I've gone, since I started podcasting in 2019, and since it started growing, there wasn't really any brotherly competitor in the scene. There were dawah-based podcasts, and there were kind of single issue type podcasts, health and fitness, mental health, all those kind of things.
Yes.
And much of the thinking Muslim, it made me improve my game, and the believers are a mirror of one another, right? There are things which I have seen you do in your shows, which I've taken positive inspirations from. And I think the show that you currently have and that you've built is a huge contribution to the Muslim and dawah ecosystem for the revival of our people.
Inshallah.
And I pray that Allah accepts it from you. And forgives both our shortcomings in the way we carry out.
And maybe just to add, we're always going to have multiple audiences. Like
sure.
If there was just one Islamic scholar that everyone went, then you're limiting your options. You need to have multiple audiences.
Of course,
right?
It's a healthy marketplace, and so as long as there is general alignment in the kind of the core issues, and there's a general alignment in like red lines, I think it's good. And I think Thinking Muslim podcast, mashallah, tabarakallah, has made 5 Pillars and Blood Brothers up their game.
Alhamdulillah.
Because and that's how it should be. At the end of the day, if you're the only person in the market, sometimes there can be an oversight in areas of improvement. But when there's someone else doing it, and there's overlaps, you take inspiration, right? Because we've shared so many similar guests and similar topics.
I'm still waiting for that meal you promised me in Bedford.
No, for sure. When you come to pick up your car, for sure I will feed you, inshallah.
That's right.
But Jalal, it was an absolute pleasure having you on.
Fantastic.
And barakallahu feek.
Thank you very much.
Brothers, sisters and friends, I hope you all thoroughly enjoyed today's podcast as much as I did, and I genuinely did. It was a great honor for me to have Brother Jalal on. And if you like this episode, remember to click subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. And if you're an avid podcast listener, you can find this show on all the major audio platforms. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.